In the last lecture, we talked quite a bit about this text input and how to style and position it. But it's important for you to understand this Flexbox system and the fact that you can create these style sheet objects to basically store them in constants you can then use in your render function to assign your styles based on that object and properties in that object. The alternative would always be to use inline styles, which quickly bloats your render function and makes it harder to read and understand. So with that, we get a text input and we can type in it. That's great. We also now need a button because the goal ultimately, of course, is to allow us to save our value and output it in a list below the text input. So we need a button. And what better place to search for one than the official documentation? If we go back there and scroll down to components, because we want to add a UI component, we see, hey, there is a button component. And the button component actually is a pure convenience component. I will also show you an alternative way of creating a clickable element. The button component is one of the very few components in React Native that actually will change its styling by default when run on different platforms. So on Android it will look like an Android button, and on iOS it will look like an iOS button. So that makes the button component really useful if you want to have a nice looking button out of the box. And as always, here in the documentation, you can learn how you may configure this button. As you see, it doesn't have that many props. So let's use it. First of all, let's import it. As always, you gotta import all these React Native components you want to use. So make sure to do that here too. And then we want to add it. So let's add it below this text input. And the button actually is a self-closing element. The text on the button is assigned with the title property. Here, I'll name this add. Now, if I just save the button like this, let's see what it looks like. Let's go back. Now we see that button below the text input. And if we click on it, you see we got this little ripple effect here, this highlighting effect on Android. And on iOS, we also got this click effect here. Still, maybe we want to have this button sit next to our place and not below it. So for that, we actually need to position text input next to button. Now, you could think that you turn this into an inline block element, but this wouldn't work because React Native only emulates CSS. It doesn't offer the same complexity on properties CSS offers, and you actually can't set elements to be inline block. You actually only have the choice between creating a flex element or not showing it at all. So you can set display to none or to flex. Block or inline block is not even supported. So this solution won't work. The solution instead is to create a nested view which also receives some flex styling so that the overall container covers the whole page and aligns elements from top to bottom with flex direction column, which is the default. But that then the first element in there is another view which will also receive some flex styling to position its child elements in a row, because its child elements should be the text input and the button. So let's add them to this view here. Now this view, of course, needs to get a style. So I will add a new one to my style sheet. In this object we pass to the create function. Next to the container property, I'll add the input container property. And the name is totally up to you. I just name it input container because it actually holds my text input element. There I will set flex to 1 so that it takes the full available space. And this will now only refer to the space in this container, of course. I'll set flex direction to row because I want to set the elements from left to right. And then I will also set justify content, which defines how to distribute the elements, to space between, so that the first element sits on the left and the second element sits on the right, and they have some space between. Now this is the input container property. We can now assign this to this view by adding the style property and then referring to styles input container. Let's save this and let's go back. Now we see some errors here. That's simply because I have a little typo here, this circumflex, which I accidentally added. So let's save this again. Now it should reload, manually reload if the error doesn't go away. And we get this setup, which doesn't look too great, does it? So the text input is centered in the page and the button takes the full height here on Android. It does so too on iOS, as you can see if you click down there. Not really nice. The reason for this simply is that the outer container of the outer view occupies the full height of the page because of Flex 1. And our nested container also has Flex 1. So it also makes sure to take up the full available space. Let's see what changes if we comment this out, if we remove Flex 1. That looks much better now. The outer container still takes the entire page, but the inner one doesn't. You may ignore the warning, by the way, we'll soon fix it. So now this looks better, but I'm not so happy with how the button looks like. It's really squeezed up on the right here. So let's fix this. If we go back, we can see that on this text input, a while ago we set the width to 300. Now let's remove this and let's see how it then looks like. If we now go back, both is in the middle because now both doesn't take that much space. So the solution is to give both a width that works together nicely. So let's add input property maybe to style the input. Let's maybe name it place input. And let's add a place button property to then style the button. And now we can assign widths here. So we can assign a width and maybe a percentage width makes sense here. So let's give this input a percentage of 70%. That has to be wrapped in quotation marks then. And for the button, I want to use 30. And now let's assign the two. So here on the input, I'll add style and set this to styles place input. And for the button, I'll also add style and set this to styles place button. Now let's save this. And if we now reload the app, it looks nicer. However, I'm still not happy with the look. One thing we can do is on the input container, so the container which wraps the input and the button, we can also set align items to decide how the items should be distributed inside the container and set this to center. This now fixes the button which is stretched strangely from top to bottom. So this now looks much better. And we also want to ensure that on the input container, we also set a width of 100% so that this takes the full available width it has. The difference to Flex 1 is that it will not also take the full space from top to bottom, but here only from left to right. So now we really got this in a way which looks nicer in my opinion. With that, we finally added a button and we played with some styling. Now let's also connect this button to an action in the next lecture and let's make sure that we actually start adding our places.